Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today with Professor Andrew Marsh on a recently published book with Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi called On Muslim Democracy. So it's an excellent book. I urge you to read it. I think it's fascinating. As you all know, Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi is not only the elected president of the parliament in the last election, in the last free and fair elections that Tunisia had in 2019. He was elected as a member, and then he was elected by his peers as president of the parliament. He's now languishing in jail, unfortunately, after the coup of 2021 on fabricated charges. Several charges, but all of them are really nonsense and without any proof or any evidence. He is also one of the main Muslim thinkers, I think, at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, especially on the topic of Islam and democracy and the compatibility between Islam and democracy. Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi has written over 20 books on this topic. Several of these books have been translated in several languages, not only English, but many other languages as well, in Urdu and Turkish and Malay and so many other languages. So he is really one of the main thinkers in the Muslim world today on this question of the compatibility between Islam and democracy. We have a pleasure of today to discuss his most recent book with Professor Andrew Marsh. Andrew Marsh is a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Professor Marsh also has written several books on compatibility of Islam and democracy and Islamic political thought. They are also very, very, excellent and timely books. And then we will have the pleasure of hearing three discussants. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He too has written several books on this topic, and maybe he can mention some of them, or I can mention some of them. But they are excellent books. Mustafa is originally from Turkey. He lives in Washington for the last several years, but has written several books on this topic of compatibility between Islam and freedom, Islam and liberty, Islam and democracy, all these things. Monica Marks is also professor at University of New York in Abu Dhabi. She is an expert on Tunisia, but more broadly on Islamic political thought, Islamism, Islamic movements in Tunisia, in Turkey, and several other countries. And then Radwan Ziadeh himself is an author. He has written several books also on this topic. So really, it's a very powerful panel that we have today. I'm glad that we were able to get all of you together in this webinar. But let's start with Professor Andrew Marsh. Andrew, please tell us in about 20 minutes the main ideas of this book, why you wrote this book, and what are the main conclusions.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Radwan, for organizing this. Thank you for all of my colleagues for joining and dedicating your time to discussing this book. I am very excited to hear what people have to say. Let me actually spend some time sharing a PowerPoint to help guide some of this. Let's see here. Am I allowed to share my screen on this?
Yes, there is a button at the bottom, yeah. Share screen.
Yep, share screen. Okay, so here's the book, and it's a little bit unique in the sense that really Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi is the author of most of this book. You'll see that the book consists of 10 essays by Sheikh Rached, translated into English for the first time. It also includes a somewhat lengthy introduction by me, which deals with the question of what is novel about the idea of Muslim democracy? So as many of the guests and participants will know, the concept of Muslim democracy has been around for quite a long time. The AKP in Turkey in the early 2000s branded itself as not an Islamist party or as aspiring to an Islamic state, but as a Muslim democratic party. Parties in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and elsewhere have been associated with this idea. And so the concept of Muslim democracy invokes or evokes a lot of different associations. One, the most obvious, is the idea of Christian democracy in Europe. And when you understand it in that context, you get a sense that the label Muslim democracy is a kind of party political branding meant to say, we are not anti-systemic, we are not aiming at a kind of authoritarian state in which Islamist parties monopolize all power. We are a party that's committed to democratic pluralism, and you should see us like you see Christian democratic parties throughout Europe. Parties that have a kind of socially conservative base, but are flexible on issues of economics and are fundamentally committed to the idea of constitutional rule. So therefore, don't be scared of us and please don't repress us. So that's one way of framing it. And there have been thinkers like Sayyid Vali Nasr or Asif Bayat who have emphasized this idea that Muslim democracy should not be seen in ideological terms, that it's a kind of post-ideological phase of the Islamist movement, post-ideological or even post-Islamist, that Islamist parties are no longer committed to their own distinct conception of the state, their own distinct conception of the political, their own distinct conception of constitutions, justice, law, so on and so forth, but are fundamentally pragmatic with regards to the political system in which they find themselves and focus more on electoral competition, good governance, and bringing into the electoral fold some kinds of socially conservative segments of the population that may have been excluded. So that's the kind of background framing and association that a lot of scholars and journalists and observers have. Now, in Tunisian context, everybody will be familiar with the well-known declaration at the 2016 Party Congress of the Ennahda Party, in which they declared to no longer be a part of political Islam and to have embraced something called Muslim democracy. Now, one way of understanding this is precisely the way that I just elaborated, that this is Ennahda being pragmatic. It's trying to achieve recognition both by outside powers like European and international powers, as well as local domestic competitors, that we are not a radical party. We are not aiming to monopolize political power. We're not aiming at an Islamic state. And it's also could also be understood as sort of acknowledging political reality. After the 2011 revolution, there was a lengthy 2.5 or 3 year constituent period in which all of the parties to the Constituent Assembly drafted a new constitution that was ultimately adopted in 2014. And this constitution, while it included certain kinds of provisions like the religion of the state is Islam and the president has to be Muslim, had no reference to the Islamic Sharia, did not refer to the state as an Islamic state. It referred to the nature of the state as a republic. And the Constitution, in any fair reading, is a fairly secular form of rule. So the other way of understanding this is that unlike in authoritarian transitions, for example, in the long transition in Turkey, perhaps Mustafa can speak more authoritatively about this, there was never a single revolution. There was never a break with the old order. There was never a single constituent moment. There was never a democratic period in which at once the new state was created. This happened over a long period of time through various kinds of points of negotiation and conflict between the AKP and the Kemal state. In the case of Tunisia, what's significant is that you had the Islamist party, or perhaps multiple Islamist parties, if you consider Tayar al-Mahabba to be in this category, actually participating in a completely open and free democratic transition in which they were the co-authors of what has to be regarded as a secular constitution. So the other way of understanding this declaration that we are now a Muslim Democratic Party is as a recognition of reality, that Ennahda was a party that had participated with other political parties in creating a new political order. Some of them in the early period, the so-called revolutionary parties, but after the crisis year of 2013 and 14, engaging in political cooperation with the party that represented the interests or the personnel of the ancien regime. And so this was sort of a pragmatic recognition of the electoral strategy and attitude of Ennahda. So that's all very well and good, but then we have some questions. What does this mean for a movement and a party, and particularly a leader like Ghannouchi, that was traditionally distinguished by its ideological orientation? And so historically, Islamism cannot be reduced to any particular class, interest, or orientation. It cannot be reduced to any particular ethnic orientation. It cannot usually be reduced to geographic or urban rural distinctions. All of these factor in various countries, but Islamism makes no sense except as a grand idea, as an ideological stance towards law, constitutionalism, forms of rule, modernity, economics, so on and so forth. So there is this question. What is Muslim democracy as an ideology? What is Muslim about it? What is democratic about it? And how is Muslim democracy to be understood or compared to previous iterations of Islamist ideology? So we've discussed in this platform before the translation of Sheikh Rached's Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which we discussed as representation of his views today. But in reality, there's a very, very large break between the views articulated in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, which calls for a state that is democratic, which calls for a state that guarantees public liberties and rights, which calls for a state that is in many cases tolerant of not only non-Muslims in the religious sense, but of non-Islamic political agendas and ideologies, but nonetheless builds the conception of politics around a fundamental assumption of moral unity within the polity. Public Freedoms in the Islamic State assumes that the vast majority of a people, whether it's understood specifically as related to Tunisia or Morocco or Jordan or whatever, or just in general, how Islam imagines politics, it assumes a people, the vast majority of which shares a moral unity around the truth of Islam, around the desirability of Islam, around the emancipatory potential of Islam and Islamic law, and imagines a way in which this people, a pious people, a praying people, a religious people, a people that sees itself as God's Khalifa or Caliph on earth, can govern itself democratically, not governed by military rulers, not governed by kings, and not governed by scholars, can govern itself democratically, but also piously. That is very different from the assumptions about politics that go into the defense and explanation of the post-2014 Tunisian political constitution. That is a political order in which all of those assumptions are replaced. Instead, the basic assumptions of politics are radical pluralism. Tunisia is constituted politically, and not only because of authoritarian restraints, but when you let the people vote democratically by radical secularists, by communists, by radical Salafis, by feminists, by neoliberal business elites, by people that are hostile to the idea of Islam in the public sphere. That is the foundation of politics. So Muslim democracy, not only at the pragmatic or party political level, but also at the intellectual, moral, and religious level, is fundamentally a response to that fact, that you do not begin with a grand assumption that we're all here basically Muslims. And so that's what's interesting. That's what's interesting about the turn to Muslim democracy, because it's a turn from what political theorists sometimes call ideal theory. What is justice or legitimacy for the world as it ought to be versus non-ideal theory? What is an acceptable mode of politics for the world as we find it? So that's what I was interested in. And I'm probably down to a few minutes. So let me walk through the book and then say a few things about my own observations and conclusions. So the first is a fairly lengthy introduction by me, in which I discuss Sheikh Rashid's career and this transition from what I call Islamic democracy as represented in public freedoms in the Islamic State to Muslim democracy as represented in a number of other essays, not only published after 2011, but particularly after that period. Then, in collaboration with Sheikh Rashid, we identified some of the most important essays to translate. Some of these occur before 2011. So a number of them are about the concept of freedom, basic freedoms in Islam, freedom first. And these are very important and I would say sophisticated essays that I think political theorists should be very interested in, because they discuss the different ways in which Islam grapples with the conception of freedom. We're all familiar with the traditional utopian Islamist conception in which Islam is freedom because Islam liberates you from your desires, from your whims, from a secular society, from things that are against Islam. And the Sharia liberates you through the realization of your higher self and your higher purpose. That is still there. But Sheikh Rashid also considers the ways in which basic negative freedom or liberal freedom or legal freedoms also have a religious value in Islam. The freedom not only to be your best pious self, but the freedom to choose or not to choose religious obligations. The freedom to be free from authoritarian domination. The freedom to be free from fear of the state. So these are very sophisticated essays in which lots of the things that we identify with neither secular authoritarianism nor the Islamic utopian ideal of perfection are given a kind of religious valence. Sheikh Rashid also talks about, exactly as the second essay implies, the dialectic of unity, difference, and political pluralism. One of the commonalities of Islamic political thought throughout the 20th century is this assumption that the people are actually religious. Any disagreement or difference or radical pluralism or secularism is an aberration. It's imposed by colonialism, it's imposed by imperialism, or it's imposed by secular elites. So you don't have to think about questions like, what if the people actually desire things other than Islam? And so he's grappling in a very sophisticated way with how Islamic political thought is committed to various kinds of unity, but has to take seriously facts of difference in political pluralism. an essay that I am very excited about, between Sayyid Qutb and Malik Benebi. Those that are not as deeply into Islamic political thought or don't read Arabic as well may have heard of Sayyid Qutb and may think that, well, Islamists are all fundamentally inspired by Qutb and Maududi and those kinds of thoughts. And that's not a lie. If you read Political Freedoms in the Islamic State, Sheikh Rached takes very seriously Sayyid Qutb. He takes very seriously Abul Ala Maududi from India and Pakistan. But he also talks about how the Algerian historian and theorist of civilization Malik Benebi was a formative influence on him from an early period. And so how to think about Islamic political thought between these two very different thinkers is a fascinating essay. And in fact, close readers of Islamic political thought may remember that Qutb himself disparages and dismisses Benebi, not by name. He refers to an Algerian theorist of civilization. And so Ghannouchi, as one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, late 20th, early 21st century theorist of Islamic politics, navigating these two thinkers is a very, very important statement. In Islam and Citizenship, he again talks about the value of deep pluralism and how certain kinds of classical assumptions about citizenship versus dhimma, or the way in which membership in the demos or is fundamentally the same as membership in the ummah, that to be a member of the Islamic community is to be a member of the political community. And so grappling with these facts of difference is something he's been thinking about well before 2011. The last three essays are very important, very influential, and chapter 8 was actually published in translation earlier by CSID, and with kind permission, we republished it. I edited the translation a little bit, but the last three are really great because these are the main places, in my experience, where Ghannouchi addresses the post-2014 constitution, all of their differences from a classical Islamic conception. And he's very clear. There's no mention of Sharia. There's all that business about how to talk about gender relations, whether it's equality or complementarity. What does it mean to say that Western human rights are universal? And he addresses these things, and he addresses the fact that there were some serious compromises made about language and substance in the Constitution, but how that's justified. And so I think that together, all of these essays are going to give a good sense of what is Muslim democracy as a distinct way of thinking about politics, thinking about political communities, thinking about law, thinking about democracy. And then most of the book is actually a lengthy dialogue between Sheikh Rached and myself that occurred over about a week in his home, in which I, as an admirer and close reader of his writings, had the opportunity to spend time discussing his ideas, discussing his intellectual formulation, reading out loud together passages from his various works and discussing them philosophically, but also pressing him on some of these issues related to pluralism, the meaning of democracy, continuity between previous conceptions of Islamic thought, and his present views. So I hope that it's very difficult to summarize this, but I hope that lots of people will read it and gain from it and feel that some aspects of his thinking were moved along by this. I want to conclude by, that's us chit-chatting. I want to conclude by answering the question that I began with, which is, what is Muslim about Muslim democracy? So in this slide, you have a pretty clear distinction between the 2 points of view. And you'll see what's interesting is that these views were published very close together. So it's not like there's the Ghannouchi of the 80s and 90s that's committed to an Islamic state, and then there's the Ghannouchi of the 2000s that is moderated. there's a lot of overlap between these views. But if you look at these two different quotes, you see that there is this long-standing view that the Islamic State is anti-authoritarian because it upholds the rule of law, but that law is the Islamic law, because the Islamic law is not human. It's not arbitrary. It's objective. It's separate from political interests. And it's not given by the state and by rulers, and that's what gives it its authority. But then, not much later, you'll see this question that, well, in Islam, there's no church. There's no authority that can tell people what Islam is and what does it mean to have an Arab Islamic identity. And so that can only ever be determined by the people, but not by some idealized people, but the actual people that exist and are governing themselves. And so, in my view, there are 5 kind of particular features of the ideology of Muslim democracy. The first is that politics is a kind of social contract. It's not seen as just a contract between the ummah and God. It's a contract between people that are governing themselves. And the subject of that contract is not the akhirah, not the next life, not moral perfection, but our worldly goods and interests that we have in common. Second is that the recognition of the fact of pluralism. Politics is constituted by this radical disagreement. And it makes no sense to wish that the disagreement were different. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if the only disagreement were between Muslims, Jews, and Christians? Because that's the way that classical fiqh tradition talks about it. No, the actual pluralism of a society gives you the contours of politics, and that's what you need to deal with. Third, the purpose of politics is to avoid more evil things. Politics is not about perfection. It's not about becoming God's caliph on earth. It's not about destroying jahiliyyah. It's not about destroying kufr. Politics is about avoiding the evils of dictatorship and authoritarianism and the lack of democracy. And the way to do that is through agreement and consensus. And so all politics has a conception of friends and enemies or self and other. But in this conception, the friends and enemies are not just determined in terms of religious identification, but where do you stand on democracy? If you're committed to democracy, for us as well as for yourself, even if you're secular, you can be a friend in that sense. But if you're opposed to democracy, whether you're secular or regard yourself as religious, that puts you on the other side of our antagonism. Fourth, there are some very interesting statements about what the Islamic Sharia is. In public freedoms in the Islamic State, it's very complicated, but Sheikh Rached takes seriously the textual tradition, the text of Islam, the tradition of interpretation, and the need to think about what is the most pious way of formulating law. In some of his statements after 2014, Sharia is just limited government. Whatever limits authoritarianism, that is Sharia. Now you might ask, what is Islamic about all this? Or what is Muslim about all of this? And the answer is Medina. The single most common justification for this kind of politics based on pluralism, based on a focus on worldly goods, is the covenant of Medina. And in that interpretation, Medina was a pluralist state. There were Muslims and non-Muslims. It was created not on the basis of divine command, but on the basis of agreement, covenant, contract between tribes and parties. And the object of the agreement was worldly goods and interests. And so Sheikh Rached says at a number of points, we Muslims are lucky that our first state was a pluralist state. So we have this model for seeing politics as a matter of contract between people that disagree about religion over shared worldly interests. And the message there is kind of, if it's good enough for the Prophet, it's good enough for us. I'm going to end here. I have a number of ways of interpreting how do we think about Muslim democracy as an ideology. Maybe we can come back to that. But I think I'd like to stop here and then hear what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for an excellent summary and presentation. There is a lot to discuss and digest, but I think you really summarized the book very well. Let's go to the three discussants that we have chosen today to discuss this book, and each one will have about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes to give us your opinion. I hope you have had the chance to read the book and perhaps ask 1 or 2 questions at the end after you give us your own views of the book and of Sheikh Rashid's ideas in the book. Mustafa, we start with you. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Radwan, for organizing this event, and for Andrew for writing this really impressive book. I went through this week, so I found a lot of interesting points, and I'll come to that. But first, I should say that Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi is really, for me, one of the intellectual pioneers, of my own thought. In my 20s, when I was really young and more hardline, I can say, I had read Sayyid Qutb, Yoldaki İşaretler, or the signpost, and as many young, Muslims who were into Islamic, world we did those days. And Sayyid Qutb was very influential in Turkey. But then came Rashid Ghannouchi. We learned about him in Turkey. His book, actually, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, was translated into Turkish later, and I was deeply impressed by that. Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi certainly represents as Andrew explained, a much more developed, evolved, or progressed, if you will, whatever you call, thinking in terms of this modern political Islamic thought. On the one hand, there's Sayyid Qutb and Masmoudi, who want an Islamic state, the Sharia governed by that. And of course, there is a big emphasis on that these authoritarian rulers, secular dictators especially, are not legitimate. So there's the laws about the ruler. So that's really an important, actually, idea in classical Islam, value in classical Islam. It's there. But also then the Sharia itself come with certain impositions, right? And it's by modern standards. So how do you deal with that? Now, in this book, I realized that, Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi has taken really even more steps, in his thinking. And I think it should be noticed by people who think about Islam and politics. And Andrew already mentioned some of them, but I would say a few more things. For example, he notes that he reminds that there are some Islamists who think democracy is kufr, right? It's the system of the infidels, and that's a hardline view. And he thinks obviously it's wrong. He compares to the views of Khawarij, even that. Saying that God should rule, but who rules in the name of God? Ultimately, nobody rules in the name of God. So what we need is consultation among the believers, not just believers, but all citizens. So he just gets away from this and shows how it's wrong to just use the idea of divine sovereignty to negate democracy, right? There's this imagined tension between divine sovereignty and the sovereignty of the people. Divine sovereignty is a cosmic, metaphysical concept, but people are, as vicegerents of God on earth, have reason and interests and values which can be legitimately managed by shura consultation. So that's a very important point. Another thing I really found important was he, as Andrew said, he emphasizes Sharia as one expression of the broader eternal idea of justice. In one place, he says, for example, wherever there is justice, God's law is in force. Now, this is different from the typical Islamist thinking, which is wherever there is Sharia, that is justice. No, he says, no, wherever there is justice, that would be God's law. So which means there can be justice outside of Islam. And he actually emphasizes that. He says Western liberal democracies, despite their foreign policies, which we often criticize rightly so, especially these days, But they might have rule of law and freedoms that we Muslims. That's why he says Muslims come to these places, and he notes that Muslims migrated to the West for freedoms, which he himself, of course, is an example. So I think that's also important. Another place is that he even emphasizes the convergence of the intentions, the maqasid of the Sharia, Islamic law, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. And again, that's different from Masmoudi, for example, who thought there should be an Islamic version of human rights, different from the UDHR, and the Islamic version only comes from the Sharia, and it doesn't have some of the things that the UDHR would include, such as the right to change your religion or equality for women and genders and all religious groups. So there are really interesting divergences from classical thought, and I think it should be emphasized. Now, one tension still remains, and I think Andrew highlighted that nicely in the discussions with Sheikh Ghannouchi towards the end. And there's this idea of the Sharia, Islamic law, being a liberating force. And on the other hand, you want to bring Sharia. One thing is that, is the Sharia a liberating force? I think in terms of limiting the ruler, yes, we've seen that throughout Islamic history. Rulers could not overtax populations thanks to the Sharia, for example. Rulers could not confiscate afkaf, the foundations, and so on and so forth. But also there are many aspects of the Sharia that will be liberating only if you believe in it. And if it was imposed onto you, if you were not willing to do that, imagine, like, for example, 5-day prayers, that's a part of the Sharia. It will be a liberating force for you if you willingly, follow these practices of Islam. But if it's imposed on you through a state, it would be an oppressive system of law. Now, here his emphasis on freedom is significant. He emphasizes again and again that Islamic laws, the requirements of Islam should be based on free choice and not by coercion. But also he speaks about still democracy somehow through constitutional courts, the Sharia being involved in the system, in the political system. Now, that is, I think, the next step that we should discuss in Islamic thought. But I do see the direction towards that in this book. For example, towards the end, Sheikh Ghannouchi criticizes ideological states, Dawla Aqadiyya, as if I'm not getting it wrong, the confessional state. And of course, he mentions examples like communist states or even French secularism, which wants to liberate people from religion with its own convictions. But he says Muslims don't have to do that. And he emphasizes the blessings of a neutral state. At least he sees the blessings for that. And that's why towards the end of the book, which I found very significant, he positively mentions a prospect of Islamic liberalism, political liberalism. And what is liberalism there? It's the neutral state, a state that is neutral towards religion in its laws, which would be, I think, it would be a full complement to the whole idea of Islamic democracy, because there is this concern that Islamic democracy or Muslim democracy, when Islamists are in power, turn illiberal. But his emphasis on the neutral state as a positive good, which he defines as Islamic liberalism, is interesting. Of course, there will still be the question, if it's a neutral state and Muslims appreciate that, what is the role of Islam? So what Islam brings? So what makes Islamic movement different than others? That's a new, I think, interesting area we should, people who are interested in the topic should look into. What are the values of Islam? How are they articulated in the modern world without any coercive measures of the state, but accepting a neutrality of the state, but still, what do you advocate? What kind of policy you advocate? So that would be a new, I think, area to discuss. But I believe Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi already opened many avenues in Islamic thought. And I think that's why his contribution is significant. It's a shame that he's in a jail in Tunisia, unlawfully jailed, just being an opposition leader by the tyranny that is unfortunately has grasped Tunisia in the past few years. I hope to see Tunisia free again, and Sheikh Rached Ghannouchi free again too.
Thank you, Mustafa. Andrew, would you like to make some comments or answer the question that he had about Islamic liberalism and the role of the state in versus Islamic values? What does it mean to be an Islamic party, and what are the policies that you're advocating if you are an Islamic party?
Yes. So this is first of all, it's a major area of ambiguity and ambivalence when you speak with him. So I'm not familiar with a point in which he's himself used the phrase Islamic liberalism or endorsed that as his own view, although I think he wouldn't have a problem saying that there are certain elements of liberalism that he sees as valuable or sees as congruent with Islam, which I think leads us with two observations. One, there are many points in which Ghannouchi does talk about the space for the realization of Islamic substantive aims and perfection and liberation that don't involve the state. So in that sense, there is a kind of congruence with certain ideas of liberalism. So he will mention, for example, various periods in Islamic history, like 9th century Baghdad, in which the state did not impose uniformity on everybody. And there were pockets of philosophers and religious minorities and even atheists, and that the fundamental site of thriving is in civil society, mosques, education, the family, groups. And so where you ought to see your perfection and your realization is in civil society. On the other hand, this leads us to a certain kind of dilemma, particularly if we are expecting it to look like liberalism, which is to say that moderate Islamic parties have to adopt a relatively pure version of the separation of church and state, or the separation of religion and politics. And so therefore, there's this obsession with, well, are they really moderates? Are they really Democrats? Are they really committed to human rights? And then you get all of these questions about, well, they opposed the inheritance law, or they wanted laws against blasphemy and things like this. And so what I argue in an article that I've published since this is that the way we ought to see Muslim democracy in this sense is as post-sovereigntist, agonistic Islamic political thought, which is it's post-sovereigntist in the sense that it doesn't begin with the imaginary that there's a single sovereign community. There's the ummah, there's the people that is already united around its moral views, and so therefore is just applying them in various ways. It begins with disagreement, pluralism, a kind of rough and tumble democracy, and the whole language of sovereignty is not as central. But this is not the same as saying that we all have an agreement about politics as never being able to include religion. It's more like democracy is the space where you can still struggle and fight for your particular views on a majoritarian basis, but you have to obey the rules of democracy. And so that's why, I want to remind people that this is not just an Islamic, recapitulation of certain kinds of liberal theory that say it's wrong to bring in your own views. Rather, it's sort of saying that everybody's going to struggle for their own views. What matters is that you recognize other groups' right to exist and right to exist as political forces, and you conduct that through democratic politics. So that would be the slight kind of clarification or qualification that I would put on Mustafa's sort of comments about Islamic liberalism.
Thank you. Monica, What do you think?
I'm really grateful to Andrew for coming out with this exciting new volume. It comes at a very important time, especially given the fact that the lead author, Ghannouchi himself, has been in prison now for nearly a year. So unfortunately, he doesn't have a way of dialoguing with us in the public space. So Andrew, thank you so much for your work, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I had about 5 different quick points of feedback that Andrew's presentation in this book generated for me. The first is the importance of recognizing the Tunisianness of Ennahda. So many people, when they talk about Ennahda, from Washington, D.C. to Abu Dhabi, they talk about it as if it's just a franchise, like the local McDonald's version of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And it's not, it never has been. And I think the chapter in Andrew and Ghannouchi's book that really highlights that is the chapter on Qutb and Benabi, because you've had that interesting generative tension, that almost dialectic between the two characters. Qutb representing the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and Benabi representing this much more secularly oriented type of Algerian nationalist critique. And Ghannouchi, as a young man, a lot of people don't recognize this, but he had an almost Steinbeckian journey from Damascus to France to Germany to Algeria, and he does all this traveling as a young man, and he toys around with different ideologies, and he's hanging out with Malik Benabi, and Benabi is a huge influence on him, as is Qutb and the Ikhwani thinkers in a different way, but so is the Zaytuna school of thought coming from Tunisia itself, and all of these things are mixing and churning together and influencing not only Ghannouchi, but his age mates and thought mates who create Ennahda in the 1970s. Which brings me to the second point that I think offers some important context here, which is Ennahda has a really unique internal organizational structure vis-a-vis a lot of other so-called Islamist parties. Unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it never cordoned women off into a separate qism, a separate division. There was always mixing between men and women. And unlike the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't founded by one dude who took on a kind of Zara-like guidance role. In fact, it was formed by 4 young men, one of whom was Ghannouchi, who were basically age mates in their teens and 20s. And they were in constant debate and dialogue with each other. So debate was a very, very important word for Ennahda's founders from the beginning. And then 2 of those 4 founders, Jorshi and Anaifer, they leave early on. And where do they go? They don't leave to defect to the right. They leave to defect to the progressive Islamists. And they stay in conversation with Ghannouchi. So he's having conversations with 2 of the 4 founders who left the movement precisely because they thought that Ghannouchi was too stuck in the Qutb, Ikhwani, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood styles of thinking, and they wanted Ennahda to highlight its Tunisianness more, which importantly influences Ghannouchi's thought, his evolution as a younger person, and the direction of the whole movement. So from the very beginning, in part because of all of these ideological and organizational factors, Ennahda, unlike a lot of other Islamist parties from Morocco to Turkey, wants to be a political party. It doesn't have this Hizb Haraka split that's so common for other Islamist movements. It's basically born political. It's a political animal, and it just wants to be legalized. And secondly, unlike a lot of other so-called Islamist parties in the region, including the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey's AKP, etc., it's not about justice and development, which are often the key words for Islamist parties. It's about democracy and opposing dictatorship and justice and development. So there's something added there. It's almost like the anti-Bourguiba party. It's these young men who feel so stifled by Bourguiba, along with the post-colonial critique and the more religious critique and everything else. That's a core part of their identity. The third point, when Tunisia goes into democratic transition in 2011, Ghannouchi has been doing all of this thinking for decades and decades that Andrew so beautifully summarizes and that his book so fantastically speaks to. And what's the point of all of that? How does that help or not? Well, I think, and I've seen this play out many, many times in my research in Tunisia since the transition in 2011 began, it gave Ghannouchi and it gave Ennahda more broadly an available democratic library of ideas, or a pro-democracy library of Islamic interpretation to quickly pull off the shelf. And Ghannouchi did that a lot of times, and other figures in Ennahda did that too. Now, sometimes it felt Ennahda, who I interviewed, a little bit forced, a little bit ex post facto. For example, when Ghannouchi was waffling about whether or not to stand with the lustration law that could have sunk Tunisia's transition by barring his main opponent, including who was a Sabti at the time, and his party, Nida Tunis, from standing in the 2014 elections. And Ennahda comes one vote close to passing that law and potentially sinking the democratic transition. And this is more hotly debated inside the party than any of the religious stuff.
Although some people would say that would have been the law that would have guaranteed the democratic transition.
Yes, there was a massive debate about this, a massive debate. Do we want to let our old torturers and their allies and the counter-revolutionaries come back into power? That's how the counter-argument, or the support of that law argument sounded. Ghannouchi ultimately decides to swing against the law, and it doesn't pass, and he lobbies his caucus to vote against it. And he trots out these kind of ex post facto arguments like, well, the Prophet, how did he behave in Medina? He forgave the people who were fighting against early Islam. And I interviewed some members of Ennahda at the time at the base level who said, we feel like we know what he's doing. He's just trying to put lipstick on what we feel is a pig here to an extent. But it's smart. It might not feel right to us, but it feels smart. And there were all sorts of fascinating examples like that, where you saw ideas picked off the shelf at key moments, and that gave the party more ideological flexibility whilst enabling it to keep more of its base on board. Didn't always work. A lot of people in Ennahda left because of that and other decisions, but it was a fascinating process to watch play out. The fourth point out of 5, I'm almost done. I always found it interesting, and Andrew, maybe this is something you could speak to. I always found it fascinating how when I interviewed people in Ennahda after the revolution about whether or not they were reading Ghannouchi before 2011 and after, not many people inside Ennahda were reading Ghannouchi, especially young people. They were reading a lot of other folks. Sometimes they'd even have read more of like Marx than they'd read of Ghannouchi. Why do you think that is? Some people I spoke to, they said, well, we just feel like his writing was kind of dry, or, it's not a core part of the party's curriculum after 2011. I wonder or anything. The years went by in Tunisia's decade-long democratic transition between 2011. Of people, including inside Ennahda, maybe mostly inside Ennahda, more passionately inside Ennahda than anywhere else, who bristled at Ghannouchi increasingly wanting to wear the politician's suits and wanting more seats of power. And this caused a lot of debate within and outside the party. And a lot of people said, Ya Sheikh, why don't you go write your memoirs or write some more reflections, hang out more with Andrew and contemplate how the democratic transition has changed your ideas over the years. But ultimately, he decided to hop into the political fray. And that was one of the factors. It certainly wasn't one of the top. Unfortunately, the return of dictatorship that we have today, which of course wasn't Ghannouchi's intention at all, but there was sort of a domino effect that got out of his control, and his leaping into politics was just one factor among many. I wonder, Andrew, if you asked him at all about that. Thanks again so much for an excellent contribution.
Thank you, Monica. Andrew?
Well, I don't want to say too much. I mean, no one has the expertise and knowledge about events in Tunisia between 2011 and 2021 that Monica has. I agree with all of the great things that she says, although I had a tiny observation with Ghannouchi tells the story about how, I think it was already Ennahda, or maybe it was still the Jama'a Islamiyya, sort of became more open to the idea of female integration after visiting Sudan. So I don't know if that's, maybe Radwan knows better about this, but
I
they
never
still
heard
have some of
anyone say that after
separation.
visiting Sudan.
Yes, he says, we went to Sudan with Turabi, and there the Sudanese women were all fully integrated into the party and into the leadership, and this persuaded us that there's no religious basis for this kind of separation. So I don't know, people with better knowledge of the history can speak more about that. I guess I'm going to say two things. One, very, very interesting point about younger Ennahda activists not reading Ghannouchi. Doesn't fully surprise me. You know, it's a book that, you know, Public Freedoms is a book that I love as a political theorist because there's reading in between the lines. It's very detailed. There's expert discussions of Madison and Montesquieu and Maududi and democratic theory. So it's something that I like very much as a kind of a great work of political philosophy. But I'm not surprised that some young democracy activist isn't going to sit there and curl up with Public Freedoms in the Islamic State. But I would be curious to what extent the ideas kind of trickle down. And so the identity of Ennahda as a democratic movement or as a movement that's committed to democracy, that's how they see themselves. I'd be curious to what extent that kind of self-understanding filters down, and then to what extent certain kinds of ideas of what that means, what democracy is, and how it relates to Islam, how that kind of trickles down. Really the most interesting question here is how Monica concluded with the distinction between Ghannouchi as a thinker, philosopher, sheikh, but also as an active politician. And on the one hand, it's precisely that combination that makes this book so important and so interesting, because Ghannouchi, more than any other, you know, Islamist party leader, more than Erdogan, more than anybody that was ever head of the Muslim Brotherhood, had status as a political thinker. And that's partly for being in exile for so long and publishing these books and fatwas. So on the one hand, Ghannouchi is there with people like Qaradawi or Muhammad Salim al-Awwa or other figures in the international Islamic public sphere as defining what an Islamic state is, what is democracy. So he gets his prestige to a large extent as an intellectual, but he gets his importance as a political party leader. And so how to read him is a very interesting interpretive question. And so all these things that he says after 2011, you know, as students of political thought, this gap between, oh, here's high theory, here's what you really think when you're just in your armchair or in your study, and then here's, you know, a pragmatic and opportunistic political thought. That distinction is not always very sustainable. So, you know, there are schools of thought like the Cambridge School that sees all political philosophy as reacting to its immediate circumstances. Even Hobbes's Leviathan, or Mustafa's favorite, John Locke's letter concerning toleration or second treatise of government. These are all real world political interventions. So I don't have a statement, but I want to keep that distinction or that combination as a very interesting one. But the other thing I want to say is even high political theory does develop out of real world problems and circumstances. So when Maududi is writing about the Islamic State, nobody's writing about that 50 years earlier. And so even things that we take for granted as exemplars of what Islamists really believe. These are also reactions to real world circumstances. The creation of the modern state, the sovereign bureaucratic administrative state, the reaction to forms of secular education, things like this. And then finally, what I find very interesting is that this real world situation that Ghannouchi is supposedly reacting to, democratic politics with many political parties with deep disagreement, with hatreds, that's not the exception. That's not some kind of like particularity. That is politics. And so one of the interesting things about modern Islamic political thought is it's not always political in that way. So you can read studies published between 1950 and 2010, published by law professors and shuyukh and this and that about, you know, the Islamic State or al-hukm, nizam al-hukm fil Islam, and they have this kind of abstract quality in which it's like they're just talking about Islamic a juridical terminology. But this idea that the actual fact of politics is making coalitions, disagreement, the fact that your view may not be adopted by everybody, this kind of non-moralistic conception of politics, that's real politics. And so if Ghannouchi is responding to that, then it's not going to be the final word, but it tells us something about what Islamist and Islamic and other intellectuals ought to be thinking about. And even if they're thinking about it in a more, they're not looking forward to the next vote in parliament or election, those are some of the questions in which they ought to be seriously thinking about, right? Because you can't just assume that the people is Muslim. When you start voting, things start to look a lot more messy. That fact is very important for thinking about politics. And if you want to claim that Islam does not have the separation of religion and politics, that's a problem that you should be thinking about.
Andrew, one question that I think Monica also alluded to, which is, I think, to me is extremely important these days, is the practicality of accepting the enemies of democracy, the people, the old regime in the new democracy. Have you discussed that at all with Sheikh Rached, especially in the last few years?
Yeah,
so before the coup happened, and was he too lenient with the old regime, in your opinion?
What was his choice? When did he have all of the political power to not be lenient? So you have people like Munsif Marzouki, like the leaders of Tayar al-Mahabba that said we had the chance, we could have seized the democratic revolution and excluded them. I find that very, very idealistic. And you know, it's very easy to forget what 2013 and 14 was like with the coup in Egypt, with the assassinations, with the cases being filed against Ennahda. This idea that his goal above all else was to prevent a coup, to prevent democratic backsliding, to prevent civil war. Those are not small goals. And reasonable people can wish that the transition had been more democratic, had been more revolutionary, had excluded them. But these are not easy things to accomplish. Even with the agreement with Sebsi, the Ancien regime wanted to fight back. I will say one thing, and this is very interesting for thinking about Ghannouchi as a democratic theorist. When you read Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, the people is everything. How do you ultimately guard against tyranny? Constitutions are not enough. The pious people will never allow tyranny. How do you bring the Sharia back into reality? The scholars are not enough. The pious people in public will deliberate about the Sharia, about maslaha, about public interest, about politics, etc. And so it's a very, very deep theory of the people as the agent who brings about the check against tyranny and morality in public. The last conversation I had with him after the coup, but before his arrest, was, what do you think of as the ultimate check against authoritarianism? And his answer was ittifaq al-nukhab, the agreement of the elites. And so you can see how he'd taken this lesson over 10 years, which is what kept it together. The fact that I could sit in a room with Sebsi or with somebody else and put aside that disagreement and say, how are we going to actually form a government? How are we going to prevent a coup? How are we going to not try to throw each other in jail? And so you can see how he got this lesson that, the real path towards democratic stability is elite bargaining. Elites get together and they're pragmatic and they put aside the worst aspects of politics and they prevent the worst case scenario. And so that, I think, is a very interesting change. And I'm sure something that he had probably had an instinct about before, because as Monica also said, there were those many years of dialogue between Ennahda and other groups in France and London and in Washington, thanks to Radwan and others. And so I'm sure the idea that democracy is made by agreement between parties was there, but it was very startling to me that the way back he saw as about elites being responsible and not taking these reckless, catastrophic decisions. Whether that can be developed into a theory of democracy, probably less important than that as a political lesson about how to actually think about politics in the real world.
Especially in times of transitions to democracy, when you still have very weak institutions and you're relying on those institutions to protect democracy, and perhaps even very weak culture of democracy during that transition. And
as we've learned in America now over the past 8 years, you're always in a transition to democracy. Democracy is never secure. It's never guaranteed. And at the end of the day, even with a constitution that emphasizes checks and balances, at some point, there has to be some vice president that's voting on whether or not to count the votes or not. And so at some point, a culture of elite responsibility seems to matter. And you're always one crisis away from losing a democracy.
Good point. Radwan, last but not least, what do you think about the book, and do you have any questions for Andrew?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, first for the book. And I express also, it's a shame to see Rached Ghannouchi, 81 years intellectuals, as a thinker behind the bar. It's our responsibility, and I think to get out for him, to get released as soon as possible for not only the Arabs and the Muslims, but for the world to benefit from his ideas and from his theories. I have 3 points. First, actually, we need to go back to the origin of his landmark book, Al-Hurriyat Al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya, the public freedoms on an Islamic state. Because the importance of the book, actually, that's what makes the name of Rached Ghannouchi, not on Tunisia, but also in the Arabic and Islamic world. We know that this book did not came, the debate within the Arab world at that time and the Islamic world was intense, especially after 1924, when Ataturk declared the end of Islamic Khilafah. All the Islamic scholars struggled with the concept, oh, we don't have Khalifa anymore.